there?
Of course, yeah.
Okay. I hope it's all right with all of you and that you can also see me. And can everyone at the back hear me?
Yes.
My children tell me my voice is far too loud, but I'm actually losing my voice, which came from shouting a lot at the rally on Saturday and speaking
Sorry, we do have some people with hearing difficulties. Would you mind using the microphone?
I'll try it, but I think it might reverberate quite a lot because of the state of my voice. Is that better? Okay, I must just try and remember to keep it at a distance. First of all, it's great to be in Brighton. Ooh, I can't go there. It is probably my favourite place to speak on these issues in the UK, and
Just hold it further down. Yeah, that's it.
And I'm very grateful for the invitation tonight. It's very special for me tonight because I'm speaking on a panel with a fellow South African, which unfortunately doesn't happen that often in the UK. And as Nimi said, you know, the people who should really be talking to this topic are those South Africans who suffered the worst of apartheid oppression, who struggled against apartheid, who played a crucial role with tens of millions of people around the world in bringing democracy to South Africa, an imperfect democracy, a democracy that faces enormous challenges. And as I was listening to Nimi describe some aspects of the solidarity between Israel and South Africa and putting it in terms both accessible but complex that I haven't heard for a long time, it reminded me of how I personally came to understand the relationship. Bearing in mind, I was brought up with enormous privilege. I had an incredible education. I had all the opportunities. I was quite rubbish at school, but as a white South African, it was virtually impossible not to go to university because most universities were exclusively for white South Africans. My mother was not South African. She was Austrian. She survived the Holocaust in occupied Vienna, hidden in a coal cellar for 3.5 years. And whenever there were Gestapo or SS raids in the area, which was a working class suburb of Vienna, she'd be rolled up into a carpet. And the carpet would be put up against the wall and coal would be packed around it. And she would tell us of the fear, because she was obviously in complete darkness. She thought all the time, oh, this is annoying me.
I'm sure they'll go.
I would far rather not. Yeah, but it's every time I move, it seems to jolt, and unfortunately I move when I speak. So I'm going to try and speak very loud, as I tend to.
Okay.
So if you can't hear after a while, just put up your hand and I'll try again. But I think, unfortunately, it will be quite disruptive.
Apparently, actually, without the microphone, you can't hear at all because of the way that
If
audio
you've
travels.
got a hearing aid, you can't hear it at all without
It's on a loop.
We've got another system. 2 minutes, Andrew.
Okay, well, I'll carry on with trying with this one.
No?
So let me carry on with this one while they're doing. So she would talk about not just being in darkness, but the fear of asphyxiation. And the extraordinary fear as a young child of hearing the boots of the soldiers. Of on one occasion having the soldiers attempt to shoot the lock out of the door to the coal cellar. And many, many years later, I took my children to see the coal cellar, and the bullets are actually still embedded in the door of this incredibly thick steel door leading to the cellar. And I thought to myself, how does one deal with that sort of fear? How could people create this fear in children? And years later, should we try and swap? Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
You can? Oh, that's great. The lady at the back, can you hear?
Oh, I see, it's not you, okay.
There's a lady there who can't. Now can you?
I don't think the microphone's working.
It is.
It is.
Would you like to change places with me? You could sit near the front if you want.
Would you like to do that? Would you like to come nearer the front? The microphone's definitely on now. Okay.
No, I don't want to.
No?
So, years later, in 1976, and you won't remember this, because I'm sure you weren't even thought of then, which was the first year South Africa got television. And it was that late because it was seen as a potentially corrupting influence. We used to have an American Western for half an hour an evening. And it was terrible, but we all used to sit down and watch it because it was so exciting to have television. And then after a while, we got what they claimed was news, which was just half an hour of propaganda. And one evening, my mom and I were watching the so-called news. And what we saw was our then Prime Minister, a guy called B.J. Foster, who had been the most brutal justice minister, who, amongst other things, had a trade unionist who was involved with ANC structures, underground structures, thrown out of a 10th floor window in police headquarters in central Johannesburg. And he was visiting Israel. And South Africa's leaders didn't make many state visits abroad, for obvious reasons. And when he arrived in Israel, the first place he visited was Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial. And my mother was vituperative. She was so angry. And I didn't quite understand. And I said to her, what's the matter? You know, we all know it's awful. She said, no, you don't understand just how awful this man is. During the Second World War, he was interned because of his Nazi sympathies and his involvement with a Nazi-supporting militia called the Ossewa Brandwacht. And here he is, paying his respects to victims of the Holocaust at Yad Vashem. In fact, she said, it is the ultimate insult to all 12 million who died. Because that's the other thing she kept on reminding us. 12 million people were slaughtered by the Nazis. And of course, half of those were Jews. But there were people who were presumed to be communists and socialists. There were people who were presumed to be gay. There were people who, in one of myriad ways, were deemed not to be fit Aryan people who were simply slaughtered, like 39 members of my mother's family were in Auschwitz. And she said, here is the Nazi pretending that he actually cares about Jews or anyone else. What she didn't tell me, but what I discovered later, was that was the visit on which B.J. Foster and the then Israeli Prime Minister Shimon Peres concluded an agreement that was crucial in both Israel and South Africa becoming nuclear powers. And that always spoke to me about the depth and nature of the relationship between Israel and apartheid South Africa. But today, and every day, we see pictures on our phones, on our televisions, of children, of babies, who are lucky enough not to have been killed yet. Sitting, some, again, if they're very lucky, getting medical attention, shaking with fear. And I can't help but be reminded of my mother's stories of being inside the carpet when the soldiers were shooting at the lock in the door. And I cannot believe that the political leaders in this country and across the global north are unmoved by this. That our Prime Minister takes South Africa's remarkable presentation to the ICJ, and he doesn't have the guts to say it, so he gets the Foreign and Commonwealth Office to say it, that they don't agree with the court. This is the same Foreign and Commonwealth Office when its most senior lawyer was presenting detailed and graphic information to the Foreign Secretary about the violations of international humanitarian law that were happening using British weapons in Yemen. The Foreign Secretary chuckled and giggled while she was explaining why this was a violation of both British and international law. There's a brilliant little film if you want to actually see this lawyer tell this story, called Wharton's War on Yemen, about the RAF base from which British weapons are flown on a weekly basis to Saudi Arabia to be used in now the 9th year of the Saudi-led coalition's war on Yemen. This lawyer, in tears, describes Boris Johnson's response to her descriptions of what is being inflicted on the Yemeni people. At which point she at least had the humanity and the principle and the courage to resign, and in violation of the Official Secrets Act, to actually talk publicly about what our government knows and what it continues to do. But what has happened in Yemen over this period of almost 9 years has happened in the space of 4 months in a far more densely populated area, one of the most densely populated conurbations in the world. And this time, the weapons aren't being flown from Wharton they're leaving from the RAF base at Cyprus. And they include what we ridiculously call the dumb bombs, and they include the so-called precision-guided missiles that are mainly made by a company called Raytheon, which is an American company, but it has a number of factories in the UK where a lot of this ordnance is made. Now, we talk about the complicity with what is happening in Yemen. And Yemen has been the most obvious violation of international humanitarian law that we've seen in recent time until Gaza. Because the judges who listened to South Africa's submission, and in the 23 years I've been working on the arms trade, on conflict, on genocide prevention, on which I've lectured at Auschwitz, where my mother's family were murdered. The lawyers at the Foreign Office and our politicians who think they know better than the 16 judges, 15 of whom believe that there is prima facie evidence of Israel committing genocide. And what made them think that? Well, in determining whether genocide is being committed, one has to determine both intent and conduct. So, the reason we know there is intent is because the Israelis have told us so. As the American judge said, the president, the prime minister, the minister of defense, the head of the IDF, amongst many, many others, all made clear their genocidal intent, to the extent that a few days before South Africa's submission, the Attorney General of Israel asked the politicians and the military leaders to stop making genocidal statements. And then, in the conduct, and if you haven't read South Africa's submission, I would solemnly request you to. It is terrifying. It is unemotional, factual, and devastating in the way in which it documents the genocidal conduct. Now, the reason that it was so symbolically important, and Nimi's given us such a good foundation and underpinning for understanding this, that it was South Africa who was bringing this case to the highest court in the world, a court that deals with only one crime, the crime of crimes. And when we saw the South African lawyers and an Irish lawyer presenting the case, it first of all reminded us that under apartheid, these people would have been defined as a woman of Indian origin, as a black African man, and as a white man. And that would have determined everything about their existence. Where they lived, what jobs they could do, what schools they couldn't go to, what park benches they couldn't sit on, what beaches they were allowed to use, if any at all, who they could fall in love with. And it was the people of this insane country that were standing up, now as lawyers and judges, in their own country, and demanding that what happened in the Holocaust, what happened in apartheid South Africa, is not allowed to continue in Gaza. That apartheid be ended everywhere. That lawlessness and unaccountability be ended everywhere. That never again, as my mother told me, it doesn't just mean never again for Jews. It means never again for every single human being. But this, of course, was a case that was immediately dismissed as meritless. The chief rabbi of South Africa, who Nimi mentioned, described it as an anti-Semitic screed and a blood libel. When I was asked about this on a BBC interview, the BBC for some reason decided to interview me again after about 6 years, when they've avoided me like the plague, since I said something rude about the weapons we send to Saudi Arabia. The first question they asked me, they clearly hadn't done their research and had forgotten why they'd stopped inviting me. Because the first question was, this is what the chief rabbi of South Africa says. As a South African Jew, we assume you concur with him. And I honestly, and this doesn't happen to me often, I was speechless. It took me a few moments to actually believe that she was asking me this question. And again, to draw on what Nimi has told us here this evening, I explained to her that when Nelson Mandela was on trial for treason, a dozen of the defendants were Jewish. But the person prosecuting them, who called for the death sentence against all of them, was also Jewish, which reflects the obvious fact that the Jewish community in South Africa, like any community anywhere in the bloody world, is diverse, broad, and has almost all political opinions you can imagine. I also suggested to the somewhat dumbstruck interviewer that the chief rabbi did not have the moral authority to make this pronouncement. Why? Because the chief rabbinate of South Africa deigned to offer very faint, quiet criticism of apartheid for the first time ever in 1985, almost 40 years after the most extreme legislated form of racism in that country's tragic history. Now, it's absolutely clear to anybody who has a functioning brain that genocide is being committed in Gaza. Even the United States government under President Biden. Now, and I don't mean to be disrespectful here, but on recent evidence, it is unclear the extent to which the president's brain is still functioning. I mean, he really, between him and one of the lawyers representing Israel, who struggle to follow the numerical order of his pages, I really worry about the quality of leadership we're all facing. And I'm going to talk a little more about that in a moment. But let me tell you why Biden knows. Because the day before the ICJ made its ruling, its interim ruling, the United States of America concluded another huge deal with Israel, an arms deal. Why would they have done it the day before? Well, because the interim ruling does create legal difficulties, even for the administration of the United States of America, even if it is incredibly difficult for us, civil society, the only people interested, it seems, in holding governments to account, have to really struggle through strategic litigation to try and ensure there is practical import to the court's decision. And what that arms deal reminded us is not just that the US, which provides over 70% of Israel's weaponry, with its obedient poodle, the United Kingdom, and many of the countries of Western Europe following behind, we have to remind ourselves that we are profiting from this genocide. Because our arms companies are making billions and billions of pounds out of the weapons we are selling to Israel. So that after killing 240 Palestinians yesterday, they're able to kill another 247 today, because we replenish everything that they have used to kill those people yesterday. And we must never forget that. And the other thing that we must never forget is that the reason the arms trade accounts for 40% of all corruption in all global trade is because those bribes, which undermined our democracy in South Africa just 4.5 years after our first democratic election, when Tony Blair and Prince Andrew, and I don't know if Jeffrey Epstein was there as well, bribed some of our cabinet ministers on behalf of BAE Systems to the tune of £115 million. But when they paid bribes in a country like South Africa, and at the time they were paying bribes in 7 other countries, totaling well over £1 billion, that same dream team. And when they pay all of those bribes, some of those bribes return to Britain in what we call the feedback principle, so that the chair of BAE Systems receives millions of pounds in bribes whenever his company pay out to foreign politicians, military leaders, and corporate executives. That Tony Blair, since leaving office, has made very conservatively, personally, over £110 million directly out of his decision to invade Iraq and his work with British and American arms makers. Those bribes are the oil that fuel our deeply corrupt political systems. And the tragedy is that my own Member of Parliament, someone who claims in his past to have been a human rights lawyer, but who doesn't believe that politicians should comment on images that they are shown of babies, innocent women and men being slaughtered, when asked whether Israel was violating international law. Because he knows that even if, because he is an appalling politician, even if he only lasts as long as Liz Truss in 10 Downing Street, I don't know if any of you remember her. She was the person who cost us, what was it? 76 billion pounds in 49 days. Even if he only lasts as long as her, he is guaranteed to be a multi-millionaire for the rest of his life, because he will do the bidding of not only the American government, but the arms companies that are all dependent on them. So, what do we do with this appalling situation that is so reflective of just how pathetic, not just our politics, but most politics, or at least formal and organized politics across the world, have become? How politics, which requires the most moral of people to safeguard our money and spend it wisely, attracts the most immoral, mediocre, and mendacious amongst us. The first thing we have to do is we have to continue to call for a ceasefire. We cannot stop turning out on the streets, reminding anybody who seeks public office in this country that if you haven't supported a ceasefire right at the beginning of this genocide, don't even bother coming to us to ask for our votes, because you're not going to get them. And we have to ensure that everybody we know feels the same way. We must look not only at the massive demonstrations that PSC and Stop the War are managing to organize almost every fortnight, with huge local demonstrations in the weeks between. We have one outside Starmer's office every alternate week, and we probably have 1,500 to 2,000 people there in Camden. But we also have to remember those who are taking direct action against Israeli arms firms. And for those of us who are able to engage in that sort of action, to do so. Because that is another way that we can hit the war machine. The other thing that we have to remember is that what was so crucial in bringing about the end of apartheid in South Africa was not just the incredible courage of the vast majority of our people who made swathes of the country ungovernable during the 1980s, but also the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement, which I'm sure many of you here participated in, which is something that we can all do on a daily basis in our daily lives. So we must both demand BDS against Israel in every possible form, but also in our own lives. We must ensure that we do whatever we can to weaken the Israeli state. Remember those oranges, what were they called? No, the South African outspan oranges that you just walk past. You got the Spanish ones instead, even if they were a bit more expensive. We're going to do the same. We're going to do the same here. And finally, Nelson Mandela said two things that are quoted most often about Palestine, and we need to remember them both. The first, he said, was that it is the most important moral issue of our time, and never has that been as true as it is today. And of course, as Nimi intimated in her presentation, the second thing is, very soon after he came out of prison, rather than dancing his Mandela shuffle and celebrating his own freedom, one of the first things he said that holds as true today as it did then is that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinian people.